Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session. It's fantastic to have you with us. I'm going to do some quick intros and updates from the HPCA. But as those of you that came in on time, well done. Thank you for being here first. If you can start the ball rolling by introducing yourselves in the chat and just saying who you are, where you work, and what you do, these are always fantastic opportunities to network and connect with peers and counterparts. So those of you online already, do get started and introduce yourselves. If you can have your cameras on, it's always lovely to have people to look at when you're delivering these kinds of things, get a sense of whether or not people are understanding, do they agree, do they not agree, just get a sense. So anybody brave enough to put their camera on, it'd be lovely to see you. So if you could do that, that would be fantastic. So whilst you make a start on that, I will just get going with providing a bit of an update. So I'm Jo Stanford. I head up the Healthcare Project and Change Association. And for those of you that might be new to it, the Healthcare Project and Change Association is a not-for-profit community interest company. We provide professional development support for the Project and Change profession, but also for everybody else as well, because everybody gets involved in projects and change. We are a community at heart, and we have about 5,000 subscribers, and everybody is welcome to subscribe to the association for free. I'll put the link in the chat. So if you're not subscribed to us, please do kind of sign up, because you'll find out more about what's going on and the events and things that can support you in your role, whatever that might be. We work very collaboratively with the other professional associations, looking at how we can support each other and each other's workforce to develop and work more collaboratively together. And we also support with development of the profession and looking at workforce development, career pathways, education and training, apprenticeships, things like that. So it's a really important thing to support the profession to develop and also to work really collaboratively with other professions as well. So you can sign up, as I said, for free to the association, but also we've got some really great events coming up. So we're doing a series of events and webinars under a title of Change Under Pressure. We know that everybody everywhere is having change imposed on them or having to deal with it. So it doesn't matter whether you're a trust, CSU, regional, ICB, national level, everybody is currently affected by change. So we've got a program of resources and events to support you, to help you get through that minefield of a process, you know, with some health and resilience. First one we have is building change resilience and supporting you to be the best that you can be through this turbulent time. And then we've got the fantastic Bryn Hodgkiss and his storytelling capabilities, helping you to think about how you can confidently tell your story. And partly that might be a practical thing in terms of you might need to reapply for your own job, you might need to look for other jobs, but it's also about reconnecting with who you are and why you're doing what you're doing at a time when things tend to be cut back to a very transactional and financial level. So do sign up for those. We are UK-wide in terms of regional networks, and these are the events that are coming up over the next couple of months. You're welcome to join any of them. You can join your own local one, but also join the others and make connections and connect with each other in different areas. So do go to those on the website. I mentioned that we do training and development. One of the things that we offer is support for people who have a need to develop a particular skill in a particular area. So we have a series of essentials courses that are one-day courses, interactive ones. There is a Midlands group, but they've just had a session a week or two ago. So do keep an eye out and register, because you'll find out when the next one comes up for the Midlands. And do join it, because it's a fantastic group. We also had, as I said, this program at Change Under Pressure. It's on the website. Do have a look. There's some resources and guidance and things to support you, as well as the events. We've got a new course coming out in November, and this is a bite-sized self-determined learning course, and it's understanding and managing change, because again, everybody's going through this at the moment, so it seems a pretty good time for anybody who's affected by change to maybe understand a little bit more about the process and what role you can play within that. So do keep an eye out for that, and if you subscribe, you will get information about that coming to you. Change management, as I say, is really key, and we've really got some fantastic professional training events as well. Tammy Watchorn, Dr. Tammy Watchorn, who does the Change Ninja, that's a fantastic course. You want to work with her on that. We do one-day workshops on change management. There's also some practical problem-solving workshops on understanding neuroscience for leading change and using Lego Serious Play. So if you're interested in solving problems that are people related or operational, cultural and behavioural change, do have a look at that. And the fantastic Bryn Hodgkiss and his storytelling masterclasses and workshops. So those are all on our website. If this is something that you think you need at the moment, your organisation needs, do get in touch and we can tell you a little bit more about it. Bryn also does a series, oops, I need to take the timer off that, around killer stories and has written a book on it, which is not for the faint-hearted. It's about serial killers in South Africa and the insights that gives you into the stories that we tell ourselves, but can be turned into a very positive spin for those of us in the health and care sector. We can how we can use some of that learning to help us tell positive stories. Yes, don't listen to the audiobook before going to bed. It'll give you nightmares. But if you like a good dramatic thriller, it's probably a good one for you. So finally, we are a not-for-profit community interest company, and so how we keep funded is through organizational membership, and our organizational membership supports everybody in the organization to develop capability and organizational maturity around portfolio program project and change management. If you don't have it in your organization, we need to think about what's going to happen once this turbulent time of change has passed, because we need to be fit for the future. And what skills and maturity do we need individually in organizations to get there? So those that are forward thinking and thinking about how we make things sustainable for the future, do have a look at that, because this could help you get to that place more quickly. And then very finally, we're really interested in what interests you and what might be the current topics or areas of challenge that are concerning you at the moment. So if you are happy to do that, if you want to click on the Menti code there and just vote for your favourite topics, ones that you might be interested in, there's a group there already, or add them to the list, and we will plan some events for the next year around the things that matter most to you. There's another Menti coming up with our speaker in a moment, but do keep this one on a tab so you can add to it if after the session. So that was it from me. It was a whistle-stop update, but hopefully that's been useful and interesting to find out what else is going on to help you as we go through this. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Adam Tuckett from the South, Central and West. Got that right? CSU. Getting all the regions in the right place.
That's the
one. Information governance lead, who is coming to give his expert insights to us around how we can use information governance as an enabler. It's not a barrier, it's something that we need support with, and we can work really efficiently and collaboratively if we work in partnership with our information governance partners. So it's going to be really interesting and interactive. So do have your thoughts ready. You can use the Q&A to ask Adam any questions, but also give your thoughts and ideas and feedback in the chat as well, because we'll be monitoring that as we go through. There is going to be a short break partway through to give everybody a chance to stretch their legs, get a bit of a refresh, and it's going to be really valuable and insightful. So do stick with us and keep commenting and contributing as we go through. So thank you so much, Adam, for giving your time today, and I will hand over the reins to you.
Thank you, Joan. It's really nice to be here with what looks like a really good number of people on this session this afternoon, and hopefully you'll find it interesting, assuring, and useful for the work that you're doing in the areas you are. And looking at the names on the list coming through and the various areas you're working in, it looks like exactly the sort of audience we aim this particular session at. Just a little introduction to myself then. So Adam Tuckett, I'm the Information Governance Consultancy Lead with South Central and West Commissioning Support Unit, and been working in the NHS in one shape or form for the last 29 years, with about 25 of those in the data protection and information governance area. Most of our work tends to be across organisations, so we really do get into some of the difficult programmes where we are looking to bring dozens, in some cases hundreds of organisations together to share data, and we do encounter quite a few problems and issues in making sure that working together happens in the most effective way. Some of the things you may have encountered yourself, some things may be new to you, and we've got a load of ideas of how we sort of tackle those things and try to make it easier all the way through. I'm not going to say we've solved it entirely, but we hopefully have got a few hints and tips and tricks for yourselves to make the process of getting from where you want to be to where you need to be, particularly with gathering and sharing information and complying with all the regulations, etc., as smooth as you can do. And like our little friends on the screen, even if you're pushing or even if you're pulling, if you're going in the same direction, we will get somewhere. Okay. General etiquette, as I'm sure most of you are aware, if you can keep microphones on mute during the session, that's fantastic. Use the chat, use the Q&A, as Joe mentioned. We'll monitor both of those for any questions that come up. And we're also going to use menti.com as well. So I'll give you another code in a second to go into that for the areas we're going to go through in this session. We'll use it throughout the session in various parts for case studies and interactivity as well. But we've got to be a bit of a negative Nelly to begin with, I'm afraid. If we don't do things properly, things will happen that we don't want to happen. And there can be actions as a result of that. And this is really an illustration, if you like, of trying to identify what we want to avoid, why we need to work together effectively, why we need to do various different things that you may have gone through in the past, like data protection impact assessments. Many of you may well know the Information Commissioner, the ICO. They police the area of data protection. They're the regulator, and they can take action against organisations that have significant failings within this agenda. And we've got two relatively recent examples for you. Fortunately, we haven't got very recent examples because there haven't been that many recently. But looking at the two particular ones here, they've got a reprimand against the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS Lanarkshire, and then a monetary penalty against Tavistock and Portsmouth and NHS Foundation Trust. All the actions by the ICO are public, so you can look at any of those if you wanted to, and that's obviously where we pick those two out. But just to highlight what went wrong and really identify why working together effectively should very much avoid the risk of this happening. If you look at DHSC and NHS Lanarkshire, this goes back a few years. These actions usually take quite a while to go through the process. They were using special category data and personal data, so in that case, a lot of health-related information, and they're using via private communication channels. In this case, it was WhatsApp. And they did that without appropriate controls in place. And what happened as a result of that is they ended up with a lot of WhatsApp chats that included patient data. They had a lot of members of those WhatsApp groups they'd set up. And part of this was during the pandemic period as well, when obviously things were probably a little bit more fraught. And at that stage, they had quite a few members of those groups who were left on those groups seeing information they didn't need to see because they didn't manage the groups very well at that stage. And that resulted in quite a few inappropriate disclosures of information. No suggestion that any harm was caused to anybody or any distress caused to anybody of any great degree, hence why this was just a reprimand. And that's effectively a bit of a public slap on the wrist. It's publicised on the ICO's website, but there's no further action. They don't follow it up necessarily, and there's no monetary penalty in that side of things. But they're doing that a bit more these days with organisations rather than penalising them, because hopefully it gets organisations to sit up and say, OK, we'll make sure we don't do that sort of thing again. And what they didn't do was they really didn't assess how they were going to use the technology. And then that way, I say that resulted in a lack of control of the use of the system, the use of the data on the system, and therefore the inappropriate disclosures. They didn't do a data protection impact assessment for what they wanted to do. Likewise, Tavistock and Portsmouth NHS Foundation Trust, and obviously this is a much more significant failing in that respect. And we've all seen similar sort of tales to this, where they managed to email on a regular basis for a little while 1,700 individuals about a gender identity clinic, and by carbon copying them into the email header, they also informed every individual on that email thread of everybody else's email addresses, which is an element of personal data. And whilst an email address itself isn't that much data, the fact it's linked to this sensitive element of gender identity, etc., and sent to 1,699 other people is what really caused the issue. And in this case, obviously, particularly with the sensitivity of the subject matter, there was a real concern that some of those, if not quite a few of those people, may have had some serious harm or distress caused to them by this disclosure of their personal data. And given it gone so broad and so wide, what would be the control about getting that data back or making sure that the leak didn't happen even further out? And that's the reason they got the monetary penalty. There are two sort of caveats to get a monetary penalty. First, it has to be a systematic failing. So it's not a human error, not one person making one mistake genuinely with best intent and just making a bit of a mistake, but actually a lack of policy or process or a lack of sufficient policy or process. And that also then to either have caused harm or have the real potential to cause harm to individuals. And you can see why that might be the case in the case of Tavistock and Portsmouth NHS Foundation Trust. And again, in the investigation that ensued prior to the monetary penalty being decided, because those things take a while to investigate, it was identified they did not really do an assessment again of how to do this. Using Outlook, for example, for 1,700 email addresses in one email is clearly a bit of a hard task. And there are many ways you can send bulk emails that actually will protect the information from that sort of disclosure. And as they'd not assessed the best way of doing that, and as they did this several times with this impact, that's why they ended up with the monetary penalty at that stage. So hopefully going through what we're talking about today and things you're already doing in your own organisations, you're not getting anywhere near this sort of reach of issue. But occasionally, unfortunately, these things will happen. Now we're going to go across to Menti, and you might already have the other Menti open, but here's a screen for you with a different Menti QR code, and I think Joe's already put the link in the chat for you as well, so you can open up this additional Menti for you as well. And I can see we have an increasing number of people going in. Just going to give it 10 seconds or so we get a number that's not dissimilar to the number of people on the session. We're about halfway there at the moment. And we're going to use this throughout the session this afternoon. So once we've done the first bit, don't close it down because we'll be coming back to it for further questions and activities. Okay, we're nearly 2/3 of the way there. Just get to the 40s or so, then I'll move the Menti on to the next question. And some of you can still join while the questions are. You can join at any time on that basis. So I'll move that on to the question we're going to be asking you. And what we're asking you at this stage, many of you being working in sort of programs, projects and transformation and change, if there's poor engagement between your activity, your program and information governance giving you advice, how likely do you think these sort of things might be a result of that sort of situation? So how likely is lack of engagement going to result in delays or amendments to the program you're doing? How likely is a monetary penalty breach from the ICO, for example, or complaints or increased costs or bad publicity? You'll see the votes come in, you'll see them move around as we go, but I'll just give you, say, a minute or so to have a go at doing that. And you may notice there's some peaks and troughs in the background. That's showing the spread of the votes at that stage. The number is the average, but the peaks and troughs show you how broad and wide some of these considerations might be. Okay, about half the, or more than half of you voted now, and it's beginning to stabilize a bit. A relatively common pattern in there. Sorry, Lynn, I can see the link's not working for you. I'll just copy it again and put it back in the chat again in case there's a problem with that. But there you go. May not make any difference, but we'll try. If you go to menti.com, you can use the code as well that's at the top of the screen, but don't put a space between the numbers. Okay, about 40 out of 53 so far in there. Some of you are probably getting familiar with how to move the sliders and things around, which is absolutely fine. The picture won't probably change that much at this stage, but as we can see, quite a few of those are scored relatively highly, which is perhaps no surprise. Delays and amendments to the programme is always the highest, although it is not far behind with publicity and reputation damage. Monetary penalty from the ICO for a data breach. That's probably a little bit higher than is the reality, to be honest with you. I haven't been on the ICO's website this morning, but I haven't heard of any recent data breach publications they've put out there. They cover all sectors, they're not just health and care on that basis, but likelihood of that is probably a bit lower, but you can see most of your votes are quite spread out on that stage. But I say you do have to make things go horribly, horribly wrong and have the impact on individuals for that to be the case. There are quite a few circumstances where things do go horribly wrong, but the impact on individuals at the end of it is actually relatively light. But it all depends on the circumstances. So I would say don't unduly worry about that one. The main issues you're going to find with this, and hopefully by the time we've been through the session, you can see how we can improve it, is the delays and amendments and increased costs. Increased costs tend not to be, in my experience, monetary necessarily. They tend to be time wasted or time needed to do things that otherwise hadn't come forward. But occasionally we can get to a situation, and this is particularly pertinent where you're buying a new system or a new service, that I have known it that people have put the contract in place, started the payments for the system, started to enable the system, and then come back to IG and say, can you help us just make sure this is all okay? And occasionally we have to say, well, actually, can't quite go ahead yet because we haven't sorted this particular risk out at that stage. IG is generally advisory. We don't necessarily have powers to say you cannot do this or you must stop doing that, etc. They may advise senior responsible owners to think about that sort of thing, But certainly it could be the case that actually the program has started paying money for something that it doesn't then get the full value of as quickly as it would like to. So the earlier we can engage, the earlier we can identify complexities, the better everything is going to be. Okay, I think we've got the majority of votes in there. Hopefully most of you can get into the Menti, because we're going to be coming back to it. So just bear with me, I'll swap back to the presentation for you. So what's it all about? It's about doing the right thing in the right way, as Joe alluded to earlier. In my experience, I say 25 years or so of this, I can't remember very many occasions at all. In fact, I can only remember one, and that's probably because it was about 9 months ago, where we said that is really not the way you want to do what you're trying to do. So we really do try and support any reasonable, ethical, and appropriate use of information. And most of the things we get asked are very much reasonable, ethical, and appropriate. They may need a little bit of finessing, but there's nothing really that ever comes through that says, nope, can't do that. That's not ethical, and that's not lawful, or whatever it happens to be, because public sector powers of organizations to do things with data, when you look at them in detail, are really quite broad. And it's just making sure what we do with it is done in the right way. So we should never see it as a stop sign. If someone says to you, IG won't allow that, question that, because in my experience, that is not the case. There have been in the past some IG managers who are really quite risk averse and perhaps not solution focused, but more and more the case, that is what the role is becoming. And most staff, even those working within organizations, are focused in that particular way. And it is all about identifying and managing risk. And as I say, early engagement will help identify complex issues and give us time to work out how to address them. We may not have the answer straight away. It may take a few days, weeks, even depending on the size and scale of the program, to come up with the best way of doing the work at that particular time. But at least we can get the thought processes linked in with yourselves about what you want to do, and linked in with the IG people about how they would help you see it being done. And it can be sometimes a little bit misunderstood that actually you may have a program that looks relatively small and not the massive beast you think it is necessarily. It might be an evaluation of a small service run by a couple of healthcare organizations working together. But by the time you work out what data you need and where it comes from and how you can link all that together, even if there's only 2 or 3 organizations involved, you can get quite a complex data picture. And particularly if you want to bring in some, let's say, national data sets or something like that as well, or comparators, etc., you get to a point where there's a lot of data being used and perhaps some complexity about who's responsible for what. And so I say, even if it's a small program, we can see some data complexities you might have to work through. We often get asked the question, well, they've already done it over there, so can't we just do it too? And the answer is generally probably yes. So it must be okay. But what we tend to find, and again, I have the benefit of having a role that, say, has worked across organizations, across ICSs, across many different parts of the country for many, many years. And we do see it's been done in, let's say, Bristol. They put together a shared care record, so someone else is going to put together a shared care record. Some of the fundamentals are absolutely the same, of course they are, but there are differences as well. And so, yes, it's been done elsewhere. Yes, they've done a DPIA. Let's beg, steal and borrow from it, but let's make sure ours is accurate to what we're doing in over this location over here, because we won't be quite the same. We did also find sometimes people say, oh, our IG lead will help and get involved in that. And particularly where we're looking at programs across multiple organizations, where there might be some smaller provider organizations, some voluntary sector organizations, hospices, charities, or whatever involved, and they've very much got an element of data to share into the melting pot as well, but they may not have an IG lead who's an expert. And if we know that from the start, we can hopefully support that person in the sort of complexities they may be encountering for the first time. Again, we tend to find IG people work in slightly different ways. There are those who are very organizationally focused. Most of you will have organizational IG leads, not necessarily a massive team, of course, but a couple of key people who keep the organization on the rails, as it were. They may not have the experience of working across sectors or working across organizations as much as perhaps other places do. And if the IG lead, let's say in a hospice, is also the corporate governance lead, the FOI lead, and the X, Y, and Z person as well, they won't know everything. So we've got to make sure we help them along. We can, if we need to, get legal views, because a lot of this is based on legislation. We can go to legal firms and get their views, etc., for an expert view. I always advise a little degree of caution on that, because there are quite a lot of lawyers out there who think they know the data protection language. They are lawyers, without a doubt, and I'm not personally a lawyer, but actually when you hear the advice they give, it's very generalized interpretation. They don't know the context. And so if you're going to work with an external law firm, find out, have they got a specific data protection team? Because then they'll have a much better idea than those who just think they know data protection. And the question being, what's a DPIA and when to do one? Many of you may have seen some, many of you might have been involved in some, but the DPIA comes from a piece of the legislation. Some of the articles, somewhere in the number of 20, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's not 26, that's joint control. Actually, no, it might be 30. And that is a part where we're doing high-risk processing of data. The legislation, the GDPR and UK Data Protection Act says you must assess any high-risk processing of data and do that through doing a data protection impact assessment. So it is a legal requirement. Technically, it's a legal requirement to scan and check what you're doing and see if it is high risk. But the moment we start using healthcare data, it is automatically high risk. And that's why we end up doing a lot of these sort of DPIAs. When to do one, when we're using personal data, when we're using it for new innovative things, etc. If someone has done something like this before, I say beg, steal and borrow what they've done, but make sure it fits with what your own circumstances will do. And then we can obviously make sure that is hopefully the easiest process to get through. And it's very interesting hearing Joe saying about stories, because a lot of this is about a story. And the very first thing we need to know from a point of view of doing a program of change and transformation and bringing the data protection and information governance elements into it is, what is that story? What is the change we're trying to achieve? IG can't write it. I'm rubbish at those sort of things. I need people like yourselves to write the strong, clear narrative that says, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to do it, and this are the benefits of it. In nice, simple terms. Literally before the call this afternoon, I was looking at a data protection impact assessment about an image sharing system within the area. I won't name the area necessarily, but the initial DPIA written about it had a very lovely, nice, detailed, jargon-full technical explanation of how they'd do it. And I thought, I can't understand a word of it, I'm sorry. And so they did put then a couple of paragraphs that just described, this is how the image sharing will work, and this is why we're doing it. And that was so much clearer. And so that initial story is much, much, much more key to doing what we need to do. That can help IG when we're discussing with you work out what type of data we're looking at. Are we looking at personal data and what level of identity do we need at what point throughout the system? And you'll see that in a second. We're almost certainly using what we call special category data, and there's our IG jargon for you. That's data that is health data or race, ethnicities, etc. We unfortunately have to bring a load of legal jargon into this as well, which we need to decode for yourselves as we go. And a key question around this in terms of the data story is, well, who decides? Whose job is it to say what data we can and can't use for the initiative we're trying to put together? Is it an IG decision? Is it time for slopey shoulders? Because no, it's not. If you said to me, this is the data we need to use, or this is the data we're proposing to use, can you decide if we need that? I'm no clinician, I'm no individual like that. I can't say what they need and what they don't need. The IG role in all this about justification and necessity is the program puts together saying this is the data we want. The IG role is then to say, how have you come to that conclusion? Who's been involved in those decisions? Can we just challenge and advise the decision makers to do the right process to come to the right answer? And so if it's been thought through and considered and they said, yep, we can clearly see this, there's a justification for that, that's why we need this, etc., then that's fine. You'll hear things like minimization. One of the principles, and this is why data protection is a bit confusing, it's all set around principles, therefore there's no hard and fast black and white rules in there. One of the principles is use the minimum amount of information necessary. And that, of course, is quite widely interpretive. And that's what we see different organizations interpreting in different ways. But bottom line, minimum doesn't mean a tiny amount. It can be what you need it to be. It's just making sure you don't have too much. So it's a balancing act all the way through. It may be an issue also if we're working across an ICS, what priority is this program compared to others? Because IG, like everything else, is a finite resource, unfortunately, and we have to obviously prioritize the ones we can respond to. And particularly in telling that story, this is what I really think, and this is something we've really tried to focus in my own work for the last couple of years. Before we even open the template DPI form, of which many variations, of course, available, we don't even want to open that until it's written down, well, what's the data? Here is a list of hopefully relatively plain English questions around the data to examine about what you're looking to do to say, do you need to collect new data? Or do you need data that's already collected elsewhere? Or a bit of both? What organizations are involved in having that data, collecting that data, or sharing that data? Do you need to link these various data sources together? Who's got the technical capabilities or the analytical capabilities to link it? And who needs access to it? And what form does that access take? Is that access to a record system? Is that reports? Is that an evaluation, etc.? And what sort of purposes is it for use for? Is it for providing care? Is it for all the other sort of analytical commissioning, reporting, population health management, cohort finding, risk stratification, a whole load of things you can think of? Is it for all of those things, or is it a combination of all of those? And whilst we're talking that at the beginning to try and say what's the data story, what's going to be used and how is it going to be used, we also start to think, well, what happens at the end? At a point, all these things will come to an end. We need to have the early ideas of what happens. But it can be quite appropriate, and again, I've literally written it this afternoon into a DPIA to say, on the decommissioning of these systems, these organisations will get together and determine what data needs to be kept by who for how long. And so putting that sort of story together, perhaps then even illustrating it, as I'll show you in a second, makes the whole process of doing the DPIA then so much easier, because you need it for the DPIA, but it helps the IG side of things look and say, okay, we can really see where risks might be now, and let's work with you about how we control those risks. And complexities may creep in. If you're using any national data sets, some of you may well be familiar with this, like the NHS England data sets available to ICBs, hospital episode statistics, or secondary use services, or commissioning data sets. They have particular rules about what you can and can't do with them that are beyond the legal regulation of IG, but we've got to be careful what they allow us to do and what they don't allow us to do. If we need to use identifiable data for things that are not the direct care of the patient, and that can be complex. It can be done, but it can be complex. And there are various things, again, if we need to identify that at the start to make sure we can manage the timescales to get that to the end, to do things in the time you need to. If we're testing a new system with data, for example, a new system you might put in place or an amendment to a system, quite often the answer is we want to use real life data for it. And that goes slightly against the sort of IG principle grain, but we can find a way. We have done on numerous occasions. And so if we can spend time working on the data flows, the descriptions, put all that together, time spent on that will avoid problems that will come up later on, and it'll make the whole process easier. And if we can illustrate it, as illustrated here, that's even better. So to explain what this looks like, and this is not a complex data flow diagram. I know it's quite a bit for you to look at in one screen on just dropped on you like that, but actually breaking it down when you look at it, the top bar is the patient pathway for a virtual ward. So first stage of the patient is identify and assess those who could be put onto the virtual ward. Then refer them to the virtual ward and then move them into a whole monitoring element of, do they need additional interventions? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? And hopefully they're all getting better and they can at the end be discharged from the virtual ward. So relatively simple patient flow. And this is done from an area from Gloucestershire who kindly allowed us to use the image here. We actually have two teams involved. We have the Gloucestershire Hospital Foundation Trust team, GHFT, and also somewhere on here should GHC, which is Gloucester Health and Care, which is the Community and Mental Health Services. Sunrise is the system used in the hospital. System 1 is the system used in the community. And they have a share care record called JUI, which is a wonderful abbreviation of Joining Up Your Information version 2. And what we illustrated here is taking each stage of the patient pathway is saying, okay, well, what happens on the system and who does it at that time? So assessment reviews under there by GHFT on their system. Community reviews by GHFT, but on GHC system, looking at the shared record for more information as well. And taking the flow all the way through, we've identified what's being done, who's doing it, and we can look from that picture to say, okay, we get to a point where two systems are generally in use for recording data. They're in use by the organisations that already have them themselves, but they're also in use by the other organisation they're working with. So at this stage, about reviewing acute interventions, the virtual ward hub team and the hospital at home team from GHC are working together on the Sunrise system for that patient. So we know then we need data sharing arrangements and we need some access arrangements for people getting access to each other's system. So drawing up that initial sort of narrative, drawing the picture then that fits with it, we can see what's going where and we can think what things do we need to put in place. There is a risk that GHC staff coming onto GHFT system look at the wrong patients. How do we manage that? And so that's the trick that brings all that out to the fore for us. Okay. Just before I go into another little bit, and we've got another Menti coming up for you, I can see a couple of questions, or a question just popped into the chat. I don't know if there's any in the Q&A at this particular stage. No yet. So feel free to post questions in both at that particular point. I'll just have a quick look at Mel's question. Okay, so if a DPA has been completed for a new system prior to the commencement of a contract for 3 years, if a decision is made to put in place a new contract for the same system once that 3 years up, does a new DPI need to be completed or for every new contract? Or can the existing DPI be applied? And is there a number of years before they can be in place before being renewed? Good question. It's all about the amount of change. So great, you've got a DPIA that's put in place. If your contract is effectively being renewed just to continue what you were doing before, and it doesn't mean that you've got any new processes, any new data or anything like that at all, you need to check and review, but you don't necessarily then need to change anything. You don't, just because you're setting a new contract in place, that's not an automatic trigger to say you must now have a new DPIA. It's about what's changed with the data, and it may be nothing. It may be in the new contract that gives you more facilities and more activity you can do, in which case you might want to review those functions and things. But at that point, you can then amend your DPIA. So the way it's supposed to work is the DPIA is supposed to be a living document that goes along with the processing of data. And so if nothing changes, my advice would always be once a year, say, just check on that one. Do we need to make any changes that we might have missed in the process of things going around? If the answer is no, that's fine. Just mark it as reviewed and updated. If, however, something has changed, you've got a new module or new supplier, etc., then make sure you do think of that change and amend the existing DPIA or do a new version of it and keep the historical one. And just Anne's question, DPIO is considered for digital systems, but are they needed for manually entered data into an internal or external system? They're about the data. They're not so much focused on the digital or not digital aspect of things. Of course, most things these days are digital, but yeah, if you're using a less digital based system, yes, DPIA, if you're using personal data, would still be required at that stage, or at least checking how much you need to do it. The DPIA should scale to fit with the system that you're using. And so if you're doing, again, a relatively small activity, you won't necessarily have a massive DPIA, but something like a virtual ward across a whole ICS system using several organizations and several systems can be quite big. So it's good to start that early. Okay. And the question key in this is really about, is data identifiable or not? We're going to bring the Menti up for you in a second, but this is an NHS England illustration that's quite useful to show you the spectrum of data from secondary use, as they call it, on the left-hand side, where it's not used for direct care, but is used for all the managing, planning and systems researches, etc. And direct care on the right-hand side, where obviously we need identifiable data because we need to have a shared care record or an EPR or whatever it happens to be. And a spectrum in between, really, where we try and reduce the identity of the data as much as we can for the use we're putting it to. So, for example, pseudonymized data under the heading of case finding. If we need to find the right people to do an intervention, the ICB might want to know how many people are at risk of XYZ. They just want to know the number. But they may say, well, the GPs then need to treat the top 10% of those, and then the GP needs to know who the person is. So we've got to work on the identity of the data throughout the process as much as we need to. And this is just a useful sort of chart to illustrate where the sort of where some segregations might happen. But it's really a question of when you use the data, gather the data and share the data, think all the way along about what identity you need at that stage. Going to bring the Menti back up for you now and advance it to the next question. And the question here for you is whether you agree or disagree. And we've got a whole bunch of data items for you there. So the situation you're in, take any of these rows of data, you'll take them each in turn. How much do these data items, if we shared them with someone else, but had no other information they could link it to, how identifiable do you think that data is? So some of the ones at the beginning are pretty obvious. It gets a little bit more thoughtful as you go down. So sharing name and address with another organization, how identifiable is that person to them? Likely it's going to be very identifiable. So if you move your sliders to where you want them to be, and we'll see again if any patterns emerge on this one. This again will be influenced by your own knowledge, experiences, etc. And one of the reasons for putting this up really is on the basis that the less identifiable the data is, the less risk there is with the data. If you get it to the point where it's what we call effectively anonymized, another slightly jargonistic term, then you may not even have to do a full DPIA. So there's always the interest, the more you can reduce the identity, the less DPIA work you have to do. And of course, putting it exactly like this in this sort of training is relatively simplistic. Life is always a little bit more complicated, but just to really give us an idea. Like most things in information governance, you could say, in this circumstance, yes, it's identifiable, but if we tweak this, then it's less. So that's why it's useful to sort of categorize it, but every situation needs to be judged on its own merits. How are we doing? Nearly about halfway there with the votes. It's kind of stabilizing a little bit in terms of where we are. Just while our last votes come in, we have the legal definition of what we call personal data, and that's data that identifies or is identifiable about the individual. And so that's, again, we look at that particularly and think, what categories of data here may be classed as not identifiable? Okay, still some more votes could come in, but just talking about what we've got there, because I don't think it's going to massively change. Name and address, unsurprisingly, yep, most of you thinking 9.5 out of 10, that's identifiable data. Yeah, generally it is. It's definitely personal data. Identity number and full postcode, like the NHS number. Obviously a little bit more tricky and a little less identifiable, but the general viewpoint taken, particularly on the NHS number, is even if you don't know whose that number is, there are so many people in the NHS, hundreds of thousands literally, with access to a system, they could put the number in and find out who it was very easily, that actually then that is identifiable. And if you think about the uniqueness of that data, a full postcode and one identity number, that is a unique individual. It may not know it's Fred, Bob, or whoever, but bottom line, it's a unique individual, so it's still personal data. Breaking down the other categories then, obviously taking out the name and address and identity numbers, but putting ethnicities, genders, age elements, and postcodes. Yep, it starts to bring it down. It's getting more towards that anonymized side of things, but it may not be fully anonymized. But if you think about the first part of a postcode, we take mine, BS30, that covers a very large area. If we have the age by actual year, as in they're 53 or whatever they happen to be, male and white, it's a relatively narrow field of potential people at that particular stage. It's not a unique individual necessarily, but again, that might not be the only data you've got in reality. You might have a lot of information about their healthcare, which then starts to make this more of a unique individual. But the more we take this down, the more risk we're taking out of the data. If we took ethnicity, gender, age bracket, 10 years and first part postcode, and we had a data set with all that information in there, and let's say a whole load about their clinical care, if we send that to the wrong person, it's the sort of information that on first viewing, no one's easily going to be able to identify someone from that. And so the data risk is much, much more reduced. To be honest, the only one that is potentially close to effectively anonymized there is the one down the bottom of gender, 10-year age bracket, county and common disease. Because if I said they're a male, age between 50 and 60 in Gloucestershire and had hypertension, that really could be, unfortunately, quite a lot of people. And it's just to illustrate the point to say the more we can reduce that down, the better things are. But of course, the more we reduce that down, the less use the data becomes. So it's trying to find that balance between the two. Okay, bear with me 2 seconds. Yep. And what we're moving on to now is thinking about the level of identity we need for a purpose. So again, we've got a number of purposes here for you, and the option between anonymized and identifiable data on a sliding scale. So just asking you really on this case, for things like case finding for proactive care intervention, do we need anonymized data? Do we need fully identifiable data? For planning or modeling demand and capacity, can we do with anonymized, or is it going to have some of those features? If you think, and truly anonymized data is when nobody can really identify that person at all. Again, just your initial thoughts in a non-scientific way as to what level of data you think is generally needed for these. And often the more interesting thing is the spread of opinion. If you look at multidisciplinary care team meetings for the moment, I know we've only got 7 votes in, but that's quite a shallow hill all the way across. So it does indicate that quite a few people have got different votes on that one. And also, while you're thinking that, there are no right or wrong answers in this respect. I also note just on the numbers of people, we've got a number of people who've joined since the Menti was put up, I think. So if I just put the link back in the chat for those who've not been able to get into it so far, because I'm noticing there's 10 difference in the number in the session and on the Menti. So those who are not yet into it, there's hopefully a link you can get into it as well. Okay, looking at that with, again, potentially half or so of the votes cast, it's not going to change massively, and it is the pretty picture we often see. Unsurprisingly, the first two are streaks ahead towards identifiable data compared to the bottom three. Not entirely identifiable data, interesting enough, though, because it depends on how you work these things. So case finding, proactive care for intervention with individuals, somebody at some point needs to know who that person is, and that person who's actually going to make the intervention. But it may be those who put the data together for doing that intervention don't need to know who the person is. So we see more and more, particularly in the sort of proactive care agenda and the preventative agenda that's coming through the NHS plan, we're going to see a lot more challenges to be able to produce the data there that people need, get it to those who will provide the services, who can then potentially re-identify through an NHS number or whatever it is, the individual they then need to contact. Similarly, with multidisciplinary care team meetings, it might be that actually you can talk about them via initials rather than necessarily full names or whatever. And so it's just being cautious and taking these sort of approaches and making sure there's no real risks run. The other three, of course, planning, demanding, capacity, etc., combining data sets, population health, ought not to need so much identifiable data, although the pop health combining of data sets will need some linking elements to be able to link data from different sources, particularly if those sources don't necessarily have the NHS number. Okay, yeah, so we see a pretty typical pattern on there, but again, thinking of that throughout the program, what are your purposes? What level do you need? Have you got a program where you've got a direct care element and a planning or managing element or a research element? Do we then need to think about the identity throughout the life cycle of the program of activity? Okay. Again, just pausing briefly, if there's any questions or queries, do say feel free to put things in the chat or the Q&A as well. I haven't seen any more pop in the chat. I don't think there's any quite in the Q&A, but feel free. Right. Moving back to our presentation then. We'll cover this topic before we take our quick comfort break about who's in charge. So we thought about why IG should help you. We thought about the types of data we're using and how we need to narrate that story about what we want to do. We now get into the sort of the real meat of the data protection impact assessment and the things that IG really need to work with program and project people with carefully and closely. And it's all about who's responsible, who's in charge, who's making these decisions. The reason we look at that is because in legal terms and regulation terms, there is this definition of the data controller. Technically, it's just called the controller, but it's easier just to refer to it as data controller because that's what people tend to understand. Now, the data controller has a particular role where they determine the purposes and the means of processing the data, and they have to be involved in deciding both. So an organization that is determining just the purposes for processing data isn't a controller. An organization that's just determining the means, and I'll explain these terms in a second, isn't a controller. But an organization that does both is a controller and has the core responsibility for the data. And the organizations can be individual, sending data between them, exchanging data for various reasons, or they can be joint, working together and collaborating together on a system. Now, if we look at some circumstances, let's take an individual controllership arrangement. So we're saying A needs data from B to do what A needs to do. And a very typical example there is, let's say I go to my optician, they say you need a referral to the eye hospital for cataract surgery. So if the optician is B and the hospital is A, then the hospital need data from the optician, the referral, and why I'm being referred and what they need to do what they need to do when they offer me the assessment for cataract surgery, for example. So that's a simple two controllers of the data. The optician's one, hospital trust is the other, exchanging data around the care of myself at that particular point in time. And that's relatively nice and easy. That's every day of the week. That's business as usual. Organization A needs data from B to do what A needs to do on the request of B. But it can get more complicated when we work together. So in a joint circumstance, A and B need data from each other to do things together. And that might be like the virtual ward example we had earlier. We've got the hospital trust and we've got the community organisation working within each other's systems to provide that care. It can get more complicated when A and B are working together but need data from C, but C isn't working with them but sharing some data to them. So let's say in the virtual ward environment, they can go out and they can ask the GP for some information, but the GP is not getting involved in the care at that stage and they're not necessarily getting any data. They're giving some data into the system. And so depending on what program you're working on and who's involved, we've got a bit of a map to draw out of who's responsible for what. And as I mentioned, the controller determines purposes and means. There may be another organisation or supplier, that it gets involved in determining just the means but not the purpose, and that's often a processor of data. So a system supplier is often going to be a processor of data because they design the system, the means by which the data is processed, but they don't have the purposes. They have responsibilities as well, but this is where I say the whole sort of shooting match comes together, and we need to be able to work through who's who and what and how we can make that work for yourselves. And just because we like life to be complicated, there are a few other things we need to consider. You're probably thinking, whose data, who's holding it, who's using it, all good things to be thinking about the data. We can have controllers in this sort of circumstance who don't actually have access or provide any data. The wonderful European Data Protection Board and their exciting publications, which I'm sure you're all going to go away and read after this session, don't do it, in 2020 stated it's not necessarily the controller has access to the data to be qualified as a controller. It's about what decisions they make and who they're making them with. And we'll see an example of that later on just to illustrate the point for you. So this bit about purposes and means, the purposes is why are we doing this? What are we aiming to achieve? What's the reason for doing this? What's the legal function of our organization? Don't get too het about the legal functions. That's again what IG exists to help and support you with. But the means is, well, how are we going to do this? What type of data? Whose data? What duration are we going to hold this data for? Who's going to share it? What system are we going to use? What's the security? So there's a lot more about the means than there is about the purposes. For those of you who've read the Data Saves Lives strategy, it breaks down the NHS and healthcare into 4 purposes around direct care, cohort type intervention type things, commissioning, planning services, and research. And you think about it, those are the 4 core things that we do. There are some sub-purposes necessarily, but we don't necessarily get too het up on the purpose. It's more about how we process the data at that stage. But if your organization or the organizations you're working with are looking at the why and the what and how and making decisions about all of those things, then they're likely to be a controller. And again, IG will help you make that determination of who is and who isn't. What does a controller have to do once you've identified who they are? Well, a little bit of legal jargon for you, and breaking it down to simpler terms. They shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure and to be able to demonstrate the processing is performed in accordance with the regulation, direct lift from the GDPR. And let's do a DPIA. So whilst you might think, oh, I don't know what these appropriate technical and organizational measures mean and demonstrate processing, all that jargon, if you're doing the DPIA, you're achieving that because that's what it's designed to do. Mentioned in the chat about the sort of period for review, and it says measures shall be reviewed and updated where necessary. So that's all about change. So if things do change, we need to review and update, or at least review, because we might find we don't need to change anything, but maybe we do. But they should do that by achieving compliance with data protection principles, and they're very, very concatenated for you here in terms of lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization I mentioned earlier, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. And you're probably thinking, how many hours is it going to take us to explain all those terms? But again, doing the DPIA supported by IG will ensure that it is lawful, ensure it's for the right purposes, ensure it's the minimum data. But again, take my advice, minimum doesn't mean tiny amounts, it means what you need. Accuracy we can all subscribe to. Storage limitation ought to be better from known as how long do you keep it for. Integrity and confidentiality is all about the security side of things. So doing the DPIA, you're meeting these legal principles and legal requirements. And we often find these days that controllership of data, particularly in a cross-organizational program, is not individual, it's joint. And organizations work together, make decisions together, and are joint controllers and have joint responsibility over the data. But as our little yellow box is telling us, that doesn't mean equal responsibility necessarily. It means the responsibilities, and there's a nice list you can always see, how to be set out and agreed between the parties. Best illustration I can make of this one, if we take ourselves back 15 years in Bristol, they started out on a shared care record program called Connecting Care. When that was initially started, the supplier needed to have a data center to store all the data from all the providers in one place so that the shared care record could be put together. And one of the hospital trusts, United Bristol Hospitals, volunteered at that stage to say, we've got a modern data center, we're happy to host the data for this shared care record in our data center. So if that data center had a problem, power supply went out, flooded, or whatever it happened to be, or was hacked into, would it be fair for anyone other than that hospital to be in the can for that issue? No, it wouldn't be. There may be joint controllers because they're making the decisions about using this system together, but actually they can split the responsibilities up either between them all, or specifically to say, for the data center security, you HPW, you are responsible for that. You're accountable to all of us as joint controllers, but the ICB, or it wasn't the ICB then, it's probably a primary care trust back then, wouldn't have responsibility for the data center. They'd ask UHPW to have that responsibility. So it's not equal. It can be split up as it needs to be within a program. Okay, we're going to do a quick case study and then we'll take our comfort break for you. So this is really just to see if any of this who's a controller of data is landing with yourselves and if it's beginning to have a bit of an understanding. And again, don't worry about getting it right or wrong. We've got a few sentences on screen to describe a circumstance. We're going to ask you to make a judgment. You'll have a lot more time in reality. You'll have a lot more information in reality to make these decisions on. It's just to see if this is landing to a degree. So let's say we've got a new blood pressure app. In this particular community, wherever it is, the ICB is actively supporting the use of this app as part of a new system-wide initiative with providers to tackle levels of hypertension. And so they've come together, the ICB and the local providers, to make a determination about how they're going to tackle hypertension. And they think this blood pressure app that people can use at home is going to be good for them. The app has been developed by a commercial company, as many of these things are. They're keen for it to be used. They're offering low-cost licenses to clinicians, and they're being funded by the ICB. So we have a supplier in the game as well, unsurprisingly. The whole idea behind this system is patients can enter their BP readings on a daily basis. It knows their current medication and dosages. If they've got any concerns about things, they can enter them on their phone. They can agree the clinicians treating them in clinics can see that data. Clinicians can use the app to respond to their queries or alerts that may be raised by the patient's data in the system as well. So hopefully it helps with sort of identifying raising hypertension and things that can be done about it, or saying that person's fine, their monitoring is all going well. All data is held by the company that provide the app. They provide the infrastructure, they hold the data on the systems, and there is currently no interaction, to make life simple, between the app itself and any of the EPRs or usual systems that clinicians use for their patient data. So your task in looking at this is to think, who are the controllers, either one organization or group of organizations together, in this circumstance? I'll put Menti up in a second so you can put the answers in, but do think about who's deciding the data is needed, who's deciding why it's collected, who's deciding who it's available to, who's deciding how long it'll be held on what systems, etc. I'll fire up the Menti for you now so you can start to think about that, put answers in, because you've got all the possible options on there. But I will put this screen back up so you can think about that while you can look at the case study. And I'll be quiet for a minute or two while you do some thinking. The votes are already coming in, but I'm not going to reveal them in case it influences your thinking at this stage. Safe to say, there is a variation of opinion. We do have quite a spread. We have a favourite. We have quite a spread. I'll go across to it in a second. We have a second favourite emerging by the look of it. Oh no, nearly. Well, we've got three, well, one clear favourite, two following up not too far behind, and a smattering of other ones. And it looks like no one has yet chosen the option of I don't have a clue, which is always encouraging. Okay, I'm going to bring up where we are on the voting because I can't see how many people have voted so far, but it looks reasonably good. Yep, 37 out of 66. So nice little hill going upwards of the votes, ranging from the app supplier, providers, ICB, all of them, ICB and providers, or I don't have a clue, which no one's chosen. Just give you another 30 seconds or so to think if you want to make a vote on that one. Okay, you're about 40 out of 60 or so in there. As I say, there is not necessarily a right answer. There are better answers than others. And I am pleased to say that the highest chosen answer is the most likely scenario in this sort of setting. It is, of course, a manufactured case study, so we can come up with a particular answer if you want to, but reality sometimes is a little bit more blurred. So the ICB and providers are almost certainly joint data controllers in this circumstance. So we can give points to people who also chose providers, ICB themselves, or all of them. The real question around this is whether the supplier is an organization that is a controller. I'll go on to my next slide so you can see the prepared answer. So yes, it could be simple, as most of you hit upon. ICB and providers, they're part of the initiative. They've agreed together that the app is the best option. They've agreed that the data that's necessary to collect and it serves their purposes of providing care. But that then does not include the supplier. If I roll back slightly, the supplier has designed the system. Oops, gone too far. And the system, if you think, is about the how. It will define the type of data. It will define the security of the system, and we have the system listed in there. So the supplier is very much said we're involved in the means of processing. But the way we look at it is, if you think about the supplier, if no one liked their product or ever bought it, then there will be no purpose for it being used. The supplier isn't providing care, they're supplying a service to those who are providing care. So the purpose of providing care is very much the ICB and the providers themselves. So the ICB and providers are very much behind the purpose, that's very clear. Provider does have some influence on the means, but actually in choosing the system to use, then the ICB together with the providers, because we said they're working together, have jointly decided the purpose, provision of care for hypertension in this particular manner, and the means, the system, etc., of how it's done. Hence why we give the answer in this case to say that ICB and providers are the controllers. Now, you might have saw I was going to say it gets more complex as well. Well, it can do, doesn't always. The supplier may wish to use the data for a particular thing, and they may wish to use it for improving their system. And so they may wish to use it for research or saying, okay, what's the most used facets of our system that we're using here? What do we need to develop next? And so they can be a controller, but probably not joint with the provider and the ICB because their purpose is different. So they may have a purpose which is development and enhancement of the app. And that's not care provision, that's making sure the app is better. And so it can be complex, but again, that's why we're here to help you through that process. Sometimes you get a supplier who disagrees and they say, we're the controller, we designed all this is all our stuff, etc. But we then have to have a very careful conversation with them and explain to them why they're not potentially the controller of what the organizations use. They don't have the legal powers of public authorities to provide care that the ICBs and providers do. And noting again, as mentioned earlier, the ICB can be a controller even if they don't have to access the data or even if they don't provide any data, because they're making decisions about the purposes and means, they are a controller. We have a quiz at the end of this session, little clue to remember there. Didn't say that for you, but there we go. So just before we take our break, and some people have only been able to be here for the first time, that's fine. As long as you've got something, it's brilliant. If we got controllership wrong, what would happen? Well, our friends at the European Data Protection Board, again, in their guidance, are very clear. Not that their guidance is written the most clearest way to find, but it is clear what it says. Controllership is determined by practicalities actions, and they say it cannot be solely attributed by policy or contract. So what they basically say is it doesn't matter what we write down, it's what we do. So if we write down we're all individual controllers, but there is a committee or a board for a program that come together and make those decisions together, that's practicalities and actions, and that would mean they are joint controllers, not individual ones if we wrote that down. The key really is making sure we identify organizations that are controllers and those that are processors, and if any of them are joint, that we make sure we identify them as joint, because joint control requires another documentation. It requires a joint controller agreement to be put in place. And if we don't do this sufficiently at the start of a project, then we might miss things. That's the worry. It might be organizations overstep their legal powers of what they can do. A processor might do more with data than they're allowed to do. It might be that an organization that is a controller is not aware of that and therefore has not considered all the things they need to put in place to meet the requirements of the legislation. It might be they get a request from a data subject saying, can I have a copy of my record, please? And they think we're not controller, we don't have a copy of your record, but actually they are. It doesn't go horribly wrong because A, we get it right generally, but B, we can make sure those gaps are filled to some degree somehow. So we need to get it as good as we can, but bottom line, putting it together in this way will get us to that stage. And just before I kick off again, a couple of things in the chat that have appeared about short DPIAs. A couple of answers hopefully have been given there that are useful. I say short DPIAs, we did see them first emerge in the pandemic. And a few years later, I've not seen one actually for a while in my own organisation. And there are no hard or fast rules how organisations do these things. That's the issue. And if you were to Google, give me a good DPIA template, you'd be bombarded with the things. The problem is it's not a lack of things out there, there are too many. The Information Commissioner's own template and their own guidance is actually probably one of the shortest in terms of it asks you about 7 or 8 different questions, but it wants very long narrative answers to those questions. Quite a few of the ones in the NHS are section by section about tick this box, answer this question, etc. And so, to be honest, if a program is processing high-risk data through the screening and therefore needs to do some form of DPIA, you really need to ask the same questions about everything. Some of the answers may well be shorter for a smaller, less detailed program at that stage, but we'll see. Anyway, if there's nothing you want me to go back over at this particular stage, then we'll carry on. But as I say, feel free to put any questions or queries in the chat or the Q&A. Seem just to be using the chat, which is fine, but the Q&A is there if you want it, but chat's probably just as easy. So we've covered controllership as much as probably you guys want to ever cover it in terms of identifying who's who and how it's important. But again, the other thing is it could in theory, and I have seen this occasion change, where organisations didn't start off as a controller and become one. We're working on a population health management program and have been within one of the areas we cover for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's the ICB who's current controller of that. But they're very keen to bring the local authority in as joint controller, and that could easily happen and change, and that again would be a DPIA change trigger. Anyway, moving on to something slightly different. Linking things you guys do to things we need to do. So program requirements and IG requirements and how some of them can overlap and link together nicely, which maybe gives you some economies of scale or at least some better ways of working together. If you notice when I said I've worked for the NHS in one shape or form for 29 years and 25 of them in data protection, you might wonder what the first 4 years were, and they were project management. Not that I was ever very good at it. I fell into the data protection role because that was probably a better home for me to be, and hopefully I've done reasonably well in that. But I do remember some of the basics, and I've worked with a lot of programs since. But what I know from my fundamental project management side of things is you're working on objectives and benefits and impacts. You're working on stakeholder relationship diagrams. You're working on business analysis, process change, process flows. You've got contracts, all those sort of things. And you might see from my not very subtle color coding on the slide here that some of the things there in the top relate to some of the things under the DPIA down the bottom. So if I look at list of partners and stakeholders, you may on the program side of things assign roles of an ownership or support. So here's the senior responsible owner or responsible organizations. These are the support organizations on your sort of stakeholder map. They're a clue to controller and processor. So an organization that owns the program from your perspective is likely to be a controller in the data protection jargon. There isn't any concept in data protection legislation of owning personal data. So we only have the concept of controlling personal data. Reason being, it's data about people, and the organizations that control it are given the trust and the responsibility and accountability to use it properly. They don't own it, it's the person's data. And you may be drawing up lots of different things as your as-is, to-bes, end-state diagrams, your business analysis, etc., and your process flows. And a bit like the virtual ward illustration we had earlier, that's useful from an IG perspective. We can overlay things on it, or we can hang things off it, etc., to identify those sort of data flows of where data comes from, where it's going to, and who's doing what with it. And that can give us this real visual picture that we can work upon. You may remember, if you're old enough like me, when the teacher used to put together the components of an igneous rock in a geography lesson to use the overhead projector slides to sort of layer one on top of the other. We can take your as-is to be end states and process flows, and we can sort of layer the data on the top, which is really, really handy to help illustrate the position. And then we get down to the element of contracts. I mentioned earlier, obviously, if you've got a supplier and you're buying a contract, then that is certainly a red flag for an IG side of things for several reasons. It will bind you to money and probably a time scale that obviously we need to support and hope we can meet. But it also binds you to organizations and suppliers, and they can go a bit wrong sometimes. So if we have a quick look at that as well. Oh, sorry, jumped over it. Actually, apologies. We've done this presentation with so many places and so many different times that was one slide we actually dropped out of the session. So, Joe, I've fallen into exactly what I said I probably would do earlier when we talked about it. But just on the contracting side of things, I can talk to you verbally about it anyway. the contract issue may be often it's a contract between one organization as the purchaser of the system and one supplier as the provider of the system. And that's fine if you're an NHS trust purchasing your EPR and you're the only organization using it, that's great. If, however, you may be sharing an EPR or sharing a share care record, or maybe sharing a pathology system, which is more and more common these days, it's often the case that one organization carries the money, pays the bills, maybe gets money from the others to do it, but pays directly to the supplier and holds the contract with the supplier. And the contract will define what we call the data processing agreement. And again, that's a legal requirement under Article 28 of GDPR that if we're engaging a processor, then a controller has to have a contractual arrangement with that organization. Sometimes it's a specific data processing agreement, if you like to call it, or more often than not, it's embedded in the supply contract to the system or the service. And now, if that's between one organization and the supplier and one controller is the organization that receives it, the other controllers, if they're joint, are not linked into that contract unless we do specific things. And so that's why when we look at that side of things, we've got to think, who's putting the contract in place? If there are 7 controllers all working together, do all 7 controllers sign that contract? Or do we use a thing called the Contract Rights of Third Party Act of 1999 to make them beneficiaries of the contract? And we know from King's Counsel advice that making them beneficiaries of the contracts, they don't have to sign it. It can still be ex-trust with ex-supplier signing it, but it lists the other 6 trusts as beneficiaries. They can enact that contract, and it's sound and legal between the organisations. So it's something that came up really 4 or 5 years ago, probably, or actually probably a bit earlier than that. And we're very cognizant now if we need to look at contracts to make sure they have the right things in there. But it's easier to look at them as they're being set out than trying to change them afterwards, of course. Okay, apologies. I didn't remember we locked that slide out because we need to focus on our risk assessments. So DPIA is essentially a risk assessment at the end of the day. The last section on it often is what risks have you identified, how do you score them, what control measures can you put in place, how do you assure they're as effective, and who's accountable. But some of the tricks within this is, depending on what you're doing, the risks related to the program may be specific to IG, or they may be broader than IG. And so you might have an issue about we're recording clinical data and sharing it to other agencies. How good is that clinical data? Data protection always has a principle of ensuring data is accurate, complete, and up to date. All good things, of course. But actually, if things are not accurate, complete, or up to date, or as good as they can be, and we're talking about a clinical service delivery here, who feels the impact of that? Is that an IG risk? Yes, in a way it is, but it's a clinical safety risk fundamentally. We've got to make sure when we look at risks that we look at them from the right lenses. And arguably a clinical safety risk, where we look at how safe this system is to use because of perhaps inaccurate data or incomplete data, etc., is a bigger lens on that risk than the IG side of things. We make sure we put it into the right sort of components. And so you may get involved in working on a clinical safety case. If you're involved in working on a clinical application, there's often a clinical safety case and a case officer involved too, who will look at the supplier's system, what their clinical safety case is, and the implementation side of that. So that there's an overlap between these areas of governance, really. You may find in terms of technical security, always a big issue these days about cybersecurity, etc. It's grown to the point that back in the day when I was a younger IG person, I was a qualified lead auditor for the British Standard for Information Security. It's not something my role is necessarily needed me to keep up with, and these days it's much broader and wider than it ever was. And to be honest, I'd have to get a lot more up to date with it than I could do if I was doing that anymore. But the whole information security agenda has grown bigger. It comes under the general IG umbrella, but most IG people focus on the legalities and the processes, and you get very specialist security experts in cybersecurity, and they will have varied appetite to what they see. And again, if you're working across organizations, and if you've been doing it a while, you can often tell which organization will have the additional diligence compared to some of their peers. And that's not to say anybody's wrong in the level of diligence they're doing, but I will know if I go to X community and we're doing a shared implementation across their systems, that trust there will spend more time on the diligence from a technical security point than the other 3 put together. And maybe they're hyper diligent. I don't know if that's a word, but that's what I'm going to apply. But it does show that they'll have different appetite. And the issue there is that can delay things. Because if you don't know they're going to react like that when you provide them with their first element of the DPIA, you might find you've got to spend a bit more time filling out things you didn't think you had to. And so it's knowing the partners, knowing the organizations, knowing their approaches, and trying to use the sort of intelligence you might have about that service to think, do we need to tackle them first? First time I saw that in that community, I thought the next program we're doing, I'm going straight to their IG person, information security person, saying, you tell me what you need and everyone else will be happy with that. And it worked. It still took a bit of time, but less time than it did having thought we'd done it all and then putting it to them saying, here's a load more we want. And if we're doing risk assessment, it's got to be sensible assessment of risk. And we'll do a risk assessment in a minute and you'll see how fun, how weird it can sometimes be. IG inherently in some cases is low probability, but it can vary indeed on the impact. And we may see that illustrated in the risk assessment exercise we're all going to go and do together. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with a 5x5 risk matrix of likelihood versus impact and a score of anywhere between 1 and 25. And again, you see the gradations of orange, reds and ambers and greens on those vary per organization. And people can be on different pages. And this is, again, another thing that can cause delays. So again, another thing to try and tackle. They'll say IG will say no, and it's not so much IG will say no, it's because they're not convinced how beneficial what you're planning to do is. Therefore, they can't express that to their IG lead who's supporting them to say, well, this doesn't really justify what we're doing, does it? Is their view. They're not convinced of the benefits, they're not convinced of the necessity. So the more we can do that collaboratively up front on any program, whether it's just a couple of organizations or a load of organizations working together, the more we can convince people and get everybody agreed and on the same page of why this is beneficial to do, then the less issues we'll have further on down the line when people say, don't agree with that risk. And in terms of program risk, if a change of objective or scope happens, it can upset the IG framework. But we're cognizant in IG that things never sit still. And at the end of the day, if things do change, we've got to be able to cope with that. And so it's something that just is one of those things that will happen, unfortunately. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have a go at doing risks. And so I'm going to put it into a scenario for you, which hopefully most of you have at least some familiarity with, or be able to think of it to some degree. If we think we're putting in together a program about establishing, running a new shared health and care record, a lot of these exist already. Most ICB areas have some form of shared care record across the 40 or so that there are. But to give you an example, we're currently doing work with a Channel Island, which will remain nameless, or looking to do work with them, when they don't have a shared care record, and they're looking to put one in place. So this still could be happening, or shared care records could be joining together. We recently were involved and have been involved for a number of years and continue to be in the Thames Valley shared care record, which is combining 3 previous shared care records into one. And so this is going to carry on for a while. You hear about national talk about a single patient record. What's that going to be? Is that going to be a concatenation of all these things together? I don't know. Anyway, our scenario for this risk assessment is we're establishing and running a shared health and care record. And of course, that requires multiple care providers, both in health and care services, that provide data from their systems so that others who need that data can see it. And so the access is many organizations feeding into one point, many of those same organizations going in and seeing the data in there. So potentially thousands of staff accessing these things and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of records. Thames Valley Shared Care Record running about 3.5 million records, probably in the region of 20,000 users. On average at the moment, 350,000 patient record access events a month. So it's big. So let's get the Menti fired up for you and let's assess this risk. But I'm going to ask you to do it in the way we should be doing it, but the way that sometimes isn't done. We're going to do it first with no controls in place at all and see what your risk scores are. And this isn't scientific and it is very quickly dirty done, and it's not, you would not spend the time we're going to spend this afternoon doing it, you'd spend a lot more. But we're going to do it with no controls in place to begin with. Then we're going to do it with a whole load of controls I can describe to you. And then we'll see obviously what changes. So if you imagine that shared care record being put together, we are not putting any controls in there about stopping anybody seeing any data in the system. So there's no role-based access, there's no context launch. Anyone who is given access to the system, thousands of staff in this integrated care system are given access. They can go in, they can see whatever data they feel they need to see. So there's no controls over what we might call an internal confidentiality breach. No controls potentially over an external one either. We've not put any firewalls or all those sort of things in place. Any hacker could easily find the system on the internet and steal all our data. And the data center, we've got no controls over loss of the data in there, no system failure controls, no redundancy, no power supplies, all those sort of things. So it could fall over any time now. And we're not doing much on the quality of the data. We'll just take any data from any organization, chuck it into the middle and see where it lands and stick it all together in any way, shape or form to see what it looks like. And then we'll take any data from anybody. They can show us the whole record if they want on all their patients. So GP practice can send us 20,000 patient records going back over the last 60 odd years on average or whatever. And so we'll have a lot of data in there. We're not doing anything about potential excessive use of that data. So, unsurprisingly, we're all quite negative, and we're all putting our scores in the top right quadrant. Out of the 10 out of 60 or so that could be in there so far. We must have people who are still in the Menti but dropped off the session because we've got a bigger number. I'll wait for that to go up, but in a moment I'll hover over each one, and whilst it's averaging out your scores, there may be quite a spread of scores that are coming through. Of course, we are really expecting this to be in the top right corner, because if we've got no controls, the likelihood of something going horribly wrong is much, much bigger. Of course, the likelihood of an ICO fine, therefore, much, much bigger. So if we get to 30 in the next minute or so, then I'll start showing you the spread of scores. Be interesting. This is usually about 2.5 times the audience we have for this if we do this for an ICB area. So see if your scores spread more or perhaps less. And reality, of course, you won't assess 5 risks in about 30 seconds. Hopefully not anyway. Right, I'm going to hover over now. If I hover over internal confidentiality breach, everything else should disappear. And you see how broad the score spread is. Well, there you go. We have from the top to the bottom, literally, on everything in between. That is broader than usual, but it's usually quite broad. Again, external confidentiality breach, pretty broad, a bit more than usual. Loss of data, broader still. Poor quality, maybe not quite so broad, but again, top to the bottom is always there. And excessive use, that's not quite as broad. We've got a bit more averaging in the middle there, and middle of the top right quadrant, which is interesting. But unsurprisingly, scores that are going across the board. So my first lesson in all of this is do risk assessment on your own. No, you don't. Can we, of course, have 52 people assessing the same risk? No, because you can't afford the resource. My advice on this on a DPIA, particularly for a cross-organizational project, is you usually find there's a lead organization that is leading the project to the sort of responsible organization. Ideally, if there's nothing else that can do it, then they should lead on the DPIA and their IG and project manager work on it together. And I would say it's okay for them to do an initial score. And of course, if you're doing a shared program, you don't need every organization doing their own DPIA. You need to do one and share it. And of course, once that first initial risk assessment is done by maybe a couple of people who know the program and know IG, etc., working together, share it across the other organizations too, and they can either agree or disagree with your scores, and it can then average out on this basis to some degree as well. But as you can see, I say there is massive variation across those scores. Okay, if we're okay to move on, of course, the next stage is going to assess these risks with controls in place and see if that makes a difference. So for our internal confidentiality breach, I'll just describe what sort of typical controls we have in a shared care record. So if you imagine a shared care record is 3.5 million people across the Thames Valley. However, you're sitting in Oxford University Hospitals Trust, you're looking at your electronic patient record, there's a button on that record that says, launch the Thames Valley Shared Care record for the patient you're already in. So you're already in patient X within Oxford University Hospitals, you press that button, up comes patient X's data. You can't go and search for all the other 3.5 million people in the Thames Valley Care record. You can only see those in your own system. So those care patients who've been treated or currently being treated by your organisation, you're narrowed down to just that scope. You're also told, contractually, don't look at things you shouldn't be looking at. You're also audited for the things you look at to make sure you're not looking at the things you shouldn't be looking at. You're also trained on that basis too. And you've also got what we call role-based access, which means you can only see certain information related to the role you have within the organisation. So you then think, okay, how likely is an internal confidentiality breach? Likewise, on external ones, we start putting in all the type of cyber security controls, if I can say it. So firewalls, penetration tests, vulnerability scans, network controls, passwords, all those things, etc., to really cut down the likelihood of these things being hacked, which isn't going to reduce it entirely, but will reduce it right down. On system failure, we host it in some form of cloud system that is obviously more secure. It has huge amounts of redundancy built in, so hard disks that fail don't actually drop the system down. Power supplies are automatic and backed up by generators. There's also a data center it will fall across to if one data center fails, etc. On the quality of data, we make sure we match the right patients to each other with lots of different controls on that basis. We put in things to make sure the right fields have the right information in them. And in terms of excessive use of personal data, because I can see a lot of voting already happening, Organisations don't necessarily share the entirety of all their records on the patients, and we decide what is useful for other people to know. And so it may be the GP only shares 12 items of data out their system, not 300. Maybe the social care only share the key facts about this case, etc. Because we don't necessarily need everyone seeing everything. We need the things they need for the point of time they need it for. So unsurprisingly, your risk scores seem to be different from the previous slide as we look to getting nearly 20 votes in or so. We've certainly moved from top right to top left. So our likelihood has gone down a bit. Impacts may be down slightly. We'll again see probably quite a broad spread. See if we get a few more votes in. Again, spread, broad on all of them. Still shows us, even when we think about controls, even though they're probably all moving down bottom leftish towards the bottom anyway, still a massive spread of organisation votes and views in that particular point. And it will probably continue in a similar sort of vein. Occasionally it goes a bit more bottom left than we've got today. Depends on whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person, and really paints a picture that the 5x5 matrix is quite a blunt tool for assessing risks. And to illustrate that point, I expect if I hover over internal confidentiality breach, we still have the full version of scores there, from 1x1 to 5x5. But if we look at the common element in the middle, then the issue we have with this, for example, as a scoring mechanism, is if someone looks at a record, they shouldn't do that. What does that mean? I've dealt with a number of these cases over the years, from ranging from very innocuous to very, 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 very bad, and to the point where actually, if someone goes into a record by accident, goes into the wrong Adam Tuckett, as my GP used to do, because my dad's name is Alan Tuckett, and he used to muddle us up completely, not the end of the world, comes out of the record, doesn't do anything with the data. If, however, they're a nosy Parker who sits there and decides, I've got 600 Facebook friends and I want to know what's happening in all of them, and puts all their details into the system and looks at them all, they may not do anything with that data, but it's obviously quite a serious breach in terms of the numbers of records accessed. But of course, the other thing that could be in here in terms of impact scoring, if we're scoring the impact of this on the basis of someone going in accidentally to a record they shouldn't be in, the impact's going to be low. But we could also think about it from the point of view of, here's a member of staff who's got particular beef against their ex-husband's new partner, for example, has gone in, accessed some information, is now doing things they should not be doing. And that has, unfortunately, of course, happened. Of course, the impact from that's going to be hitting 4 or 5s for the distress and things caused too. So whilst one is more likely than the other but has a lower impact, the other is less likely but has a higher impact. And how do we score in between the two? I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately, but that's because most people use this 5x5 matrix, and I've not seen something that is easy to use, but better yet. But anyway, you can see the point there. Don't score risks on your own. Work with others to try and do them. But certainly controls do bring these things down. And the reason for sort of highlighting that at that particular stage is more along the lines of actually when we think again about accountability and other things too, we've got to make sure that at the end of the day we are, and the point was made in the chat about the DPIA, that if you've got a DPIA that you find you don't need to do one for, make a record of the fact you don't need to do it, because then that shows you did think about it. And in this case, obviously in risks, we're saying, okay, we've scored it at this level, we put these controls in, we believe that's gone down. It's not necessarily scientific to show it's gone down, but we do have an idea that makes the effect. And then we can show that we have thought about that, we have put those controls in place. And if something still goes wrong, because we seldom eliminate risk, we get to the point where actually saying we've done what we reasonably can. I can give you examples from the ICO side of things. Again, we won't mention the area, but one organisation, they had a process by which they released information out to a patient who asked for access to their records. This is where a father asked for access to his child's records. The organisation put together a pack of the information that the father could have access to, having checked he was parentally responsible and the child wasn't of an age where they'd make their own decision. And at that stage, they released probably, I think it was in the region of about 300 pages of information to the father. They went through it relatively carefully to identify information about other people they'd have to take out, or information that might cause harm. And they made some redactions in that information too. However, they managed to miss one page. And in that one page, there was 16 other children's details in there. So they went through, looking for things that should be taken out, and turned over 2 pages at once, effectively. Didn't see that page. Those details went out to that father. ICO got involved. Investigation was undertaken. What they found at that stage is they had a process. They had quite a good process. They had a human error on one occasion where it failed. And so there was no action taken against the organisation, despite the fact this father received details of 16 other children that he had no involvement with. Wasn't a huge amount of detail on necessarily, but obviously you can think in that sort of circumstance, it was particularly around mental health and safeguarding, that's really quite sensitive. But because of the processes they had in place, having assessed the way they do things, they were basically given, not get a jail-free card, but an easy ride to say, look, you did all you reasonably could. Human error will always creep in. They did then, again, revise their processes, because the one thing they did do is they kind of did a sort of 50% check that they checked. They had one person redact it, another person checked the redaction and worked, and they checked sort of alternative pages. And nowadays they just say we check every single page, because we don't want to go through this again. So a lot of time was spent dealing with the issue and dealing with the investigation, but no reprimand, no penalty, no public sort of flogging, as it were, by the ICO at that stage, because they had tried to do the right thing and they could evidence that being the case. Okay, conscious we're getting towards the end, just a few things to finish up, and then we have a quick quiz. So how to make good progress, how to do this DPI, where to find all the information you need, because there's a lot needed in quite a few of these big forms. Well, I would not Google it very much if I were you. As I mentioned earlier, IG is not an area which is lacking in guidance. You'll have the regulator, the ICO, lots of guidance out there. It's not health or care specific in many, many cases, so it requires a bit of interpretation. There are other parties out there who feel it is their responsibility to put out guidance. There is the Office of the National Data Guardian. You'll have heard of the term Caldecott Guardian, no doubt. That is an individual nationally who is tasked with sort of collaborating that sort of work across the country. So yes, their guidance is good. Yes, their guidance is related to the NHS and health and care. But you'll find the GMC, the BMA, the Royal College of GPs, they'll all have their guidance around this sort of information. And it's from a certain perspective. So you'll find a lot out there, but it's finding the right thing. And occasionally that can be a problem, because people who are doing this on the stuff that you're doing, the programs you're doing, looking at what they think they should be the case, they'll find guidance that doesn't agree with what you say, because another party doesn't agree with the way these things are done. So you've got to be careful in looking at what is out there. So the best way of getting guidance is really speak to your IG lead, and get into their agenda, get into their diary and things, and get a meeting in place to make that happen. In terms of including detail in the DPIA, they could be very, very long and detailed if you really, really want them to, but it doesn't always help. But pitch the description of what you're trying to do, that narrative, the story I was talking about at the beginning, as if you're describing it to the public. Because if as an IG person working for many years, I see that sort of thing and I can understand it, it's just so much easier at that stage. Try not to get lost in the jargon, which I know is not easy to do, and I know I've used a lot of jargon in this too, so it is endemic across the system, but nice and clear, nice detailed description or document of the data flows, and then we can really start to pick the risk factors out there. Again, stressing the element of early engagement where you can do, because there will be complexities in some of the things you do. And if you don't address that complexity and you're doing it across an organisation or several organisations, you'll go to partner organisations and say, we've done this, what do you think? And they'll find the complexity you've not spotted, and that'll throw things into delay. They'll say, oh, we can't even consider this until you've addressed that issue there. So doing that at the beginning, identifying the complexity and having the answers or the ideas, if you haven't got answers ready, will make that part partly easier. And the idea is the project lead should commence with what needs to be done and why, with whatever detail you can put into it, meet with IG to review, and then assist throughout the remainder of the process. It becomes a very collaborative effort to put the thing together. It really is a joint effort at that stage. When you have your meeting with IG, things that are useful to bring, if there's any priorities or initiatives that are across the ICS or the Integrated Care Partnership, what's the commitment? What's the identification of priority? Are there going to be any parts of this organisational structure that are less committed to this that's going to cause a problem? Again, this clear description, that links to necessity, links to justifications of using data, organisations involved, stakeholder relationships, controller processor stuff. Clear description, always that clear description of what data you need. Admitting at that stage you might not know everything. You might think we've got a good idea now, but we haven't quite grounded this out. That's fine. As long as we know that is not necessarily the final picture, we can at least start around it. We can identify the bits that you're more sure of than the ones that you're less sure of. Again, if you're particularly procuring anything, trying to get into that procurement as early as we can to make sure contractual elements are put in place. And any questions, of course, you want to get answers to. To which IG hopefully will give you some answers and probably some more questions to go away with is usually the effect. So, with just a few minutes left, let's have a go at a quiz just to highlight and end the fun for you. Does mean I've got to just swap the Menti around, so bear with me a second. I've not yet worked out a slick way of doing this, of having two Mentis open at once, because it doesn't like doing it. And I've got to clear the results from yesterday, which I forgot to do. There we go. It's a different Menti code, and it doesn't have a QR code on this one, unfortunately, but if I copy the link and stick it in the chat, that should take you there. And again, if you're doing it on a phone or something like that, then www.menti.com with the code again I'll put in the chat. You can see it on screen, but you don't need the space. There we go. This is just for a bit of fun. There are no prizes, unfortunately, other than bragging rights for getting it right. Answer correctly and answer swiftly to get the most points is the usual way. I'll just wait for the number of players to slow down a bit before we kick it off. Don't ask me how it allocates pictures or names, but it does. Even got a ghost in there getting quite topical. Okay, we've got 25 in. Might get a couple more. Just give it another 5 seconds and I'll kick it off. Oh, there we go. Well, we went up to 25, then we dropped to 24 and back to 25 again. Right, going to start it off now for you. Here we go. So question 1. Which of these is a real role under the General Data Protection Regulation? Read the questions and the answers carefully. And there we go. Controller of data, absolutely. Data owner, mentioned it earlier. We don't have a concept of ownership in data protection. It's just about controllership. But it's we see this come up time and time again. It's totally understandable. So no problem with that. Question 2. In IG, the abbreviation DPIA stands for what? Read the answers very carefully is my advice to you. Given the speed that came through, I think a few of you went straight for an option. You may have picked the wrong one. There's a trip hazard in here. And we tripped 4 of you up. Yeah, data protection impact assessment, not data protection impact agreement. Very subtle difference, designed to get you, and we got a few of you. So not bad though. We usually get a couple. Question 3. What determines if an organization is a controller of data in a project? Again, remember what was said earlier. Okay, majority of you correct. It is just about decision making. Typically their data will be used and typically they will have access to the data, but they're not required to have that to be a controller. It's just about the decision making. So the 6 and the 3 are the general sort of positions out there in the big wide world. But actually we do say, let's say, for example, ICBs may not have any data to be used, may not need to use any data in the system, but may be involved in an integrated care system-wide project. So it isn't necessary the data is used or available. It is about decision making. So 2 more questions to go. DPIA should be completed by whom? Project manager, IG lead, collaboration, or the last person to duck? Yeah, so ideally a collaboration. If you're a project manager, you've done loads of them, maybe you can do pretty much most of it if you've been that experienced with it, which is fine, just needs an IG check. IG lead, we'd love to be able to just pick them up and do them for you, but we don't understand your program. So we need to know all about the program, and that's best done with you. So collaboration is the key really to this. And the last question before we find out who's got the biggest score. Why do we assess risks? document assess effective controls, to show we're sorted, or so we can debate which numbers to pick. Full score on the last question. There you go. Great. To document and assess effective controls and illustrate that we've done so, of course. So on the next button, we'll see who's won the quiz. But I say the only prize is bragging rights for the rest of the afternoon. There we go. Puffy. Puffy will probably remain anonymous, but well done, Puffy. You have won the quiz with 3,535 points. Well, that's pretty close on that scale there. So well done. Okay, just to close off for you then. So we got 10 minutes and there's no more questions I've seen in the chat. I don't know if there's any in the Q&A at this particular point. Looks like there isn't. Soft sales pitch. South Central West Commissioning Support Unit. We're a consultancy team. We can help with your transformation programs. Feel free to contact me. My email address is there. You may have heard CSUs obviously have a limited lifespan, but we believe it's at least till March 2027, so we're not going anywhere quickly. And every chance our service will transfer somewhere else. So feel free to get in touch. Happy to take any questions or comments we have now. Joe, I can see you come back on camera as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Adam. Can we just give Adam a round of applause for that fantastic insight and really interactive session? I think you definitely did the job of making it interesting and engaging and really valuable content there for everybody to take away and apply practice. Thank you so much. I've put the link to the feedback form in the chat. Please do complete that. It is really important for us that we get the feedback because that helps us justify the events that we put on and make most of people like Adam's valuable time. And thank you so much for your time today, Adam. Does anybody have any questions? Here's your opportunity. You've got 8 minutes to grill Adam on the burning questions that you have.
Rachel's put one in the chat about how much in advance of a possible project commencing would you recommend starting the DPIA? What I recommend, Rachel, is that narrative of what you want to do. It's not necessarily directly in the DPIA form. They don't necessarily set them out in that particular way, but I mean, feel free to use the questions in the slides when you get them to say, these are the questions I need to be able to sort of describe and write down. And when you say project commencing, I guess it depends on what counts as commencement of a project, doesn't it? There's almost never too early. It's more a question of we can start at the same time as your project commencing, really, or just ahead of it, depending on what you define as commencement. But we can't get everything sorted quickly necessarily because there'll be questions you don't know yet that we'll need answers to, as well as you needing answers to get to that final point. So engage as early as you can to get the item on the agenda onto the resource of your IG, who will obviously be, as I say, finite in what they can assist with. But bottom line, yeah, if you've got questions you still need to answer about your program, we won't be able to finalize what we're doing with you, but it's better we start, if that helps.
Yeah, and I think from my experience, I'd just sort of add to that, there's always a burden of effort on people's time, and particularly things like information governance or procurement, and all of these are generally going to be a natural part of your project planning process. So making that connection at the start, you've got a project to do, these things are likely to come up. Have a conversation, let them know it's coming, give them some time and say, just give them a general overview. And then you can plan in and they are aware of it and they can work with you on when best suits both of you. And that helps you with your timescale planning as well. So that would be my tip.
I see another one for Katrina. Are there different considerations for DPIA projects involving artificial intelligence? That's a very, very good question. It's a difficult answer, to be honest with you. An AI project will almost certainly, in most cases, use some form of personal data. Not all of them will, but most of them will at that stage. And so we've been looking at this quite distinctly in the last sort of 9 months or so and sort of skilling up on AI. Most of it is fundamentally the same sort of question areas. What's more likely to be the issue is different kinds of risks that AI presents, and that's probably something your IG needs to get involved in, maybe more than perhaps yourselves. And that's, of course, AI is going to be your specialist area, of course. What we see there is things like typical DPIs don't necessarily assess the risk of AI hallucinations or issues with the data or where it makes things up, for example. And I know a lot of organizations are looking to tweak their DPIAs for some of the AI risks, which, again, we're involved in doing directly ourselves. The other thing around the AI side of things, it often is it can't unfortunately be seen, and I'm trying to sort of battle this with my own organisation, that IG is obviously going to be involved in many AI developments, but we can't be the only governance element in there. There's clinical safety, there's potentially HR issues around job changes or job issues, etc. Cybersecurity around a lot of it too. That it's kind of the sort of challenging event that doesn't really have much of a lead area within the organisations as we're currently structured. Because I've sat here as an IG person saying I can't lead the work on AI. I can very much contribute, but I can't lead on it. And the clinical safety would say, well, we can't do everything because it's only the ones with clinical aspects we need to get involved in. So it feels like the sort of the challenge without a home in some ways as to who might step up and lead it. But from the DPIA perspective, not a massive change, but yes, some considerations, particularly around the risk about does a large language model keep the data it learns upon, for example. Typically they don't, but new forms of risk for IG and others to assess together, really. Any more questions people want to pop in? Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, no, that was a great question, and very, very topical, I think, at the moment. Everybody's worrying about how we integrate AI into safety and actually get the benefits from it in terms of improving our delivery capability. Any more questions? I think that's it.
I think everyone's keen to get to their next meeting, aren't they? So thank you very much for everyone's time this afternoon.
Yes, and thank you, Adam, for your time and giving that to all of us for free. That's been a fantastic insight. Please do get in touch with Adam if you do have any more questions or make use of their services. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and participating in this really interactive session. And do complete the feedback form and give us some good data to work with as well. And thank you again for your time today. Hope you have a great rest of the day and week. And thank you again, Adam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you again.